What does it mean to raise the hue and cry? Why did the Middle Ages have such gruesome criminal punishments? Or did they? Without microscopes, DNA, fingerprints, photographs, and scientific forensics, how did CSI Middle Ages ever find the perp? These and other questions will be answered right after this. I'm Professor Jerome Arkenberg, and I have been teaching a wide variety of history courses at colleges across this country for the past 30 years. In this video, I'm going to tell you about medieval policing, proving guilt or innocence through the ordeal, trial by combat, appealing fellow perps, escaping trial through benefit of clergy, medieval trial by jury, jailbreaks, right of sanctuary, abjuring the realm, outlaws and outlawry, and punishments and penalty. At the end, I'll have the wrap-up quote in this video. But first, make sure to click like, share, and especially subscribe, and that little bell thingy, so I can continue to bring you more great videos just like this one. To maintain the king's peace, the frank pledge tithing system was established on collective responsibility. If a crime was committed, any person who witnessed it had to raise the hue and cry. And it was, crime, follow. And everyone in the area, and the only exception, I do mean everyone, the only exceptions were lunatics, children, and the sick, had to join the chase. Monks, nuns, friars, anybody's in the area, everyone had to join the chase. Until the miscreant was apprehended, or the entire community would be heavily fined. If the miscreant was not caught, all in the neighborhood were warned he or she was in the area likely hiding out, and the sheriff could call out the Posse Comitatus. In other words, armed local men to pursue the accused until he or she was caught, at which point a male fugitive could be beheaded on sight, and a female fugitive could be drowned on sight, as long as the coroner was present and the fugitive had not claimed sanctuary. Now, if not caught in the act, an accused was guilty until proven innocent, which was done until 1164 by swearing innocence by a sacred oath, with usually 12 oath helpers vouching for him or her through compurgation. This, of course, seems fairly easy to do, but 12 upstanding oath helpers, known to be upstanding in the community. If you're naming 12 others who are kind of criminals, that doesn't work it. But of course, the idea is on pain of your eternal damnation, and virtually all medieval people really worried about this. This entire process is called compurgation, like this. Who among you will swear I am innocent? If no one, you are in sad trouble. Or the accused could submit to the ordeal. There were a number of these. A priest, though, had to be present to invoke divine judgment. So, first off is the ordeal of bread. A priest would place a slice of barley bread, and it had to be barley bread, on which the Lord's Prayer had been written, along with a slice of cheese, all weighing no more than 1 ounce, and this would be placed in the accused mouth while holding a cross of poplar wood, and again, only poplar wood, over the accused head, while the latter stood with a cross of poplar wood, again, poplar wood only, under his right foot, the priest then exorcising the accused 3 times and praying God to prove innocence or guilt, while the accused finally swallowed the bread and cheese without chewing it. If guilty, the accused would fall into convulsions and die, or probably at least choke to death. If innocent, no problemo. The ordeal of fire. Here, the accused held a burning metal rod in his hands or her hands for a time certain, then had his or her hands bandaged. If after 3 days the wound had healed, he was innocent, but if it festered, she was guilty, and suffered the full penalty. The ordeal of cold water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river or pool of water. He or she was guilty if they drowned, but innocent if he or she floated. And the ordeal of boiling water. The accused removed a stone from a pot of boiling water, or boiling oil, or boiling lead, then had his or her hand bandaged. If after 3 days the wound had healed, he or she was innocent, but if it festered, they were guilty and suffered the full punishment. Trial by combat or wager of battle was also available to the accused in England, but only after the Norman conquest. This was known on the continent, but not in England until the Normans came after 1066. Now, if the accuser was over 60, lame, blind, a female, a child, a priest, a citizen of London, or a lord, they could decline, and trial would then be by jury. Otherwise, both accuser and accused, or the latter's champion, would be given leather armor and shield, war hammers, cudgels, or spears, and would fight to the death, but only from noon to sunset. So if the trial by battle started any time before the stroke of noon, it was illegal. Also, of course, if it continued after sunset, even if there's still some light, also illegal. Let me see a picture of what this would have been like. At any point, if the accused surrendered, he was at once hanged. Whereas if the accuser surrendered, he was only outlawed. But if, after sunset, the accused were still alive and fighting, the accused went free, and the accuser was outlawed. In the course of the 13th century, as trial by jury replaced the ordeal, trial by battle fell into disuse, though technically it remained legally available, and the last wager of battle conducted in 1818, after which Parliament repealed its use. Occasionally the condemned will, before their hanging, appeal his fellows or his enemies of complicity in their crimes. Even though the condemned was still hanged, those appealed were arrested and tried, and if they failed to pass compurgation or an ordeal, or later a jury trial, they too were hanged, and perhaps themselves appealed others through the same process. This, of course, is a great way to get back at your enemies, or those who you thought had backstabbed you, figuratively, or turned you in. So, of course, you're going to die anyway, but you take them down with you. Now, if, however, the accused can claim benefit of clergy, and in theory, this applies only to the clergy, he or she would be tried in the courts Christian, under canon law, where acquittals were common, and no death penalty could be applied. So if you could do it, you normally, if you're smart enough, you would claim benefit of clergy. Now, how do you prove that? Because there are many different types of clergy. Now, as lay literacy increased, as I said, non-clergy began to claim the benefit. And since the biblical verse used was always Psalm 51, many miscreants memorized it. Though if the defendant was notorious or accused of a heinous crime, they might be given a different verse to trip them up and ensure conviction. It's like the old movie trope or television trope. You got to pass an eye test. You memorize the chart. So you think you're doing it, but in the meantime, they have switched the eye chart on you. Now, a key event in terms of criminal trial occurred in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. Here, the church forbade clergy, all clergy, from participating in all forms of ordeal and battle. So the jury, which had been in use in the heirs and assizes, took over as the finder of fact. This means ordeal disappears. Battle should have disappeared, but it sort of did, but technically it was still in the books. Since 1166, sheriffs had to impanel a jury of presentment for every assize, heir, and quarter sessions. So 12 to 23 franklins, free peasants of the county, freemen of the county, were to report under oath as to all crimes committed in the neighborhood. So kind of like a grand jury, except that the jury of presentment tells the sheriff and officers what's been going on and who are the guilty parties. Now, at the juries of presentment, no witnesses were heard or evidence presented, because the presentment jurors were to know the facts before being impaneled. By the mid-14th century, presenting jurors were forbidden from sitting on trial juries. And trial juries first appeared for breach of the king's peace in the 13th century. So who would sit on the trial jury? 12 jurors would be summoned by the sheriff from the neighborhood and were sworn to say the truth. But again, they were not meant to be impartial, not meant to be ignorant of the facts of the matter as we see today, but they were expected to be familiar with the case. And all those involved in it, no matter if this was a criminal case or even just a simple civil case. By the 14th century, the jurors could examine witnesses and evidence, and by 1380, jury tampering became a felony, such that nobody was allowed to speak with them while the jury was in session. The jurors were, nor could you give them food or drink, so jurors were normally sequestered, forbidden from eating or drinking, speaking with others, or provided a fire or even a candle until they had rendered a unanimous verdict. And if they refused, they would be carted around the judicial circuit until they did. This might take months. English juries, however, were notoriously prone to rendering acquittals, mostly as jurors were drawn from the elite of peasant society, who, perhaps not surprisingly, were themselves or their sons the ones most likely to commit a crime because they thought they were the big shots in town and thought they could get away with it, and they usually did. Given that the one and only penalty for felony conviction was death by hanging, jurors would often be condemning their own relatives or friends and so refuse to convict at all, unless the accused was some sort of psycho or a mass killer or serial rapist. Like this guy's, sorry, Fred, your kid Jimmy has gotten out of hand. We've repeatedly warned him, it's too far. Jailbreaks, however, were far too common. Remember, the jail was not a prison where you're supposed to hold the miscreants for 10, 20 years or whatever, but just to hold the miscreant until a trial. Jailbreaks, as I said, were common because local men had to guard the jail for free, take time out of their day, and if they're serfs and peasants, instead of trying to working to make food or have a job, you got to guard these prisoners for free. And though the fine was heavy on any community that let prisoners escape, the cost and lost wages for the guards and for feeding the prisoners often meant a minimal degree of alertness. Now, let's say you have managed to free yourself from a jail. Once you reached a church, monastery, friary, convent, or even an abbot's house, or a shrine, or the yard around it would do, the fugitive, he or she, could claim right of sanctuary for 40 days. The locals having to feed him for free and see that he not escape sanctuary upon a heavy fine. But as with jail, it was often cheaper to simply let them escape. At the end of the 40 days, if not before, the criminal had to leave sanctuary. If he refused, while he could not be dragged or kicked out, beaten or whatever, it was a hanging offense to feed or aid him in any way. So that would include any of the clergy who are there. You can't give him food or water. That is, he would either die of famine and thirst or leave sanctuary and be executed on the spot. So here, of course, you see the picture. Oh, so it looked like 4 men trying to drag a perp out of sanctuary. That is a criminal felony in and of itself. Of course, the criminal might be able to escape. So leave sanctuary and then immediately claim sanctuary elsewhere. Okay, you're at one monastery, you're able to cross the street or just go right next door and claim it again. You can keep on going. 40 days, 40 days, 40 days. It's suppose after a while you get tired of it, but okay. Or the miscreant, the fugitive, could surrender to the coroner or sheriff for immediate hanging, kind of a death wish, I guess. Or he could abjure the realm and leave the country for life, at least in theory, under the supervision of the coroner after he had confessed his guilt to the coroner. Those who abjured were to take the most direct route out of the country. So if you were in England, take the most direct route to Ireland, Scotland, France, or the Low Countries, or Wales, at least before 1282. By land or sea, you are not allowed to tarry more than one night per locale, unless you are at a port waiting to take ship, such as this abjurer here. Now, if you're waiting to take the ship, maybe there's no shipping, it's a bad season, there's storms, whatever. While you're waiting, every single day, you had to walk into the sea at least up to your knees, walk barefooted, and wear only an unbelted long white robe, carrying a wooden cross before you. And of course, after a while, after about an hour, there's no ship. You can get out of the sea and try again tomorrow. Abjurers were then sent on their way. Unguarded, yes, unguarded. Presumably, they would be afraid to violate their oath against God. So, however, it turns out many of the abjurers were killed by vengeful relatives before they got too far, or others by locals along the way. So very few actually left the country, as most who were not at once killed threw away their crosses and took on a new identity, or perhaps joined a gang of outlaws. Who is an outlaw? An outlaw is everyone who is deprived of all legal right, meaning that anyone could kill them on sight, and nobody was allowed to give them food, drink, shelter, clothing, or aid them in any way on penalty of a felony, the felony of aiding and abetting. Outlaws had to be formally declared outlawed in court. It's not just any bad person walking around. They had to be formally declared such in court. And the outlawry had to be recorded by the coroner in his rolls. But again, an outlaw need not be a convicted felon, because there are a whole variety of ways you can become an outlaw. Just as under church rules, there's a whole variety of ways under which you could be excommunicated. So, if you were accused and you fled from justice, or you failed to appear at the court when summoned, or you escaped from sanctuary or prison, or you failed to abjure the realm, or even if you only refused to appear or plead in a civil matter, in a dispute, you would be outlawed. Any captured outlaw could be hanged without trial, but only under certain conditions. So the coroner had to be in attendance, and the coroner had to certify the fact of outlawry from his rolls. So you can't just hang anyone that you think is an outlaw. You got to make sure he or she is an outlaw. And you can only do that from the coroner, who has to consult his rolls. And if that declaration of outlawry has never been done, you cannot do that. If you do it anyway, again, that's the felony of murder. Now, the outlaw might have been publicly reinstated into the law by the coroner, so eventually does show up at the court proceeding. pays a fine. Of course, the outlaw could also simply buy a pardon. Or the outlaw might have been pardoned as a reward for service to the king. So you're not necessarily an outlaw forever. Now, the penalty for all felonies was death by hanging, using a simple slip knot. They didn't know anything about the hangman's noose, so in other words, after the drop, your neck wasn't broken, because they didn't know how to do nobody invented the hangman's knot yet. So they simply did a simple slip knot around your neck, meaning the hanged person slowly died of strangulation, taking anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, a slow and painful death. However, it was rare but not unknown for a person so hanged to later revive when laid out in the church, which of course is going to scare the crap out of anybody who sees this happening. Somebody you think is dead suddenly sits up bolt upright. But at this point, they are always pardoned by the king, because clearly God did not want that person to die. So God has rendered divine justice and brought that person back from the dead. Now you might imagine, how might this happen? Well, I think it's probably going to depend on how thick your neck is and how strong your neck muscles are. Remember, you're strangling, they are not breaking your neck. So you might simply pass out, and they don't often know how to tell really if you're dead. You don't have modern medicine. They think you're dead. Turns out you're just really unconscious. Then you later sit bolt upright and scare the crap out of everyone, and then the king would normally pardon you. This, however, was quite rare. This does not happen all the time. So it wasn't uncommon, but it was still pretty damn rare. The wrap-up quote. There are two kinds of homicide. The first is called murder. This is done secretly, out of sight and knowledge of all but the killer and his accomplices, and so cannot be immediately followed by the hue and cry. No one is allowed to make an accusation of this kind unless he is a blood relative of the deceased. There is another kind of homicide, which in ordinary speech is called manslaughter. In this plea, no one is allowed to prove an accusation unless he is a blood relative of the deceased or bound to him by homage or lordship, and can speak about the death from what he has seen himself. In this plea, a woman is allowed to accuse another of the death of her husband if she speaks of what she saw herself, because husband and wife are considered by law to be one flesh. Ranulph de Glanville, 1180. So, let me know what you think of this quote in the comment section below. Also, what you liked about this video and what other historical topics or subjects you'd like to see in future videos. Be sure to click like, share, especially subscribe, as it will help me bring you more great videos, and click on that little bell thingy so you'll know when the next History Waits for No One video is posted. If you want to know more, there are recommended studies on this topic in the description below, along with other ways to connect with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the past.